Welcome to part one of the Antebellum South, which is simply just a fancy way of saying life before the Civil War. And with that said, we'll start by looking at the North. And as you can see by looking at the map here, the North had started emancipating their slaves rather early, and by 1804, New Jersey becomes the last northern state to free their slaves. However, with that said, it doesn't mean that life was great for these freedmen, as many times these freed African Americans were seen as social outcasts. They were still discriminated against. There was still racism. There's might be tough to find jobs. You may not feel safe. But nevertheless, they were still free, something that the Southern slaves won't get until the 1860s. And one of the issues we see come up time and time again is what to do with the issue of slavery as we continue to grow our borders and expand west, and as new states enter the Union. The Southerners were under the belief that slavery had to expand or die, because they knew if it didn't continue to expand to new states, eventually the number of free states would outnumber the number of Southern states, and therefore eventually they could be able to abolish slavery. Well, in the Missouri Compromise, also known as the Compromise of 1820, we see that Henry Clay comes up with several issues that will hopefully settle this question for a while. And what they decided upon was that Missouri would become a slave state. Maine would be allowed to enter the Union as a free state, and that would keep the balance of free and slave states. They also drew the Missouri Compromise line at 3630, which outlawed slavery from the rest of the Louisiana Territory. And we're going to see that eventually, however, that line will be challenged and abolished. Now, turning our attention to the Southern way of life, there are some things that kind of characterize it. One is that social prestige and influence was somewhat partially determined by the ownership of slaves. Those who owned more slaves were more wealthy and tended to control politics. Even those that didn't own slaves accepted slavery, kind of on the basis that hoping one day they too might be able to afford slaves and create more wealth for themselves. However, the South does lag behind the North in certain aspects. They don't have as good of transportation system or financial system. They're very, very slow to industrialize, and they'll kind of focus their economy on agriculture. But when it comes to agriculture, there's still some differences throughout the South, as what we'll see is this agrarian life kind of differs between the upper South and the lower South. The upper South tended to kind of diversify its crops, and they tended to maybe industrialize a little bit more than the South. Now, in the South, you can see here, cotton tended to be the cash crop of choice. And really, it's said that cotton is king, or King Cotton, kind of dominated the South. Because by the 1860s, over 5 million bales of cotton will be produced, and it actually accounts for 57% of the total U.S. exports. And with greater diversification of their economy, what we see too is that the North also has less slaves. There's not the same demand as there is in the South because of that diversification of crops and industrialization. And here's another way to look at it by these charts. You can kind of see that the border states, or I should say the upper South, sometimes had smaller slave populations, as opposed to some of those lower South states. For example, Mississippi, which had 55% of their population was slaves, and South Carolina was 57%. No wonder South Carolina kind of leads the charge in defending slavery and eventually threatening secession. However, the South believed that slavery offered greater long-term security than employer-worker relationship. They kind of looked at the North and said, well, you may have free workers, but you pay them very little and you treat them very poorly. And they kind of said tried to defend slavery, saying that they treated their slaves better and provided food and shelter for their slaves. And therefore, the South obviously also believed, kind of this idea that, slavery, once again, it must continue to expand or else it would die out. Now, as slavery kind of comes to dominate the Southern way of life, you see that these wealthy white plantation owners will become the kind of the leaders of society. However, the largest part of the white Southern society are the yeoman farmers. These are basically independent farmers. They're kind of they tend their own fields. They work their own land. They're very proud and self-reliant because it'd be maybe a husband and wife working the fields together without any slaves. Now, they tended to farm smaller plots of land, but they tolerated slavery, hoping to one day maybe own slaves themselves. So the non-slave owners a lot of times followed the leadership of the slave owners, hoping to aspire to one day to rise in the ranks of Southern society. And of a U.S. population of roughly 23 million people at this time, a little over 9 million live in the South. And of that, a little over 3 million are actually black slaves. And as you can see by these two maps, the cultivation of tobacco obviously expands westward over time. Several contributing factors would be one, a lot of times plantation owners cultivated cotton in their crops until the fertility of the land they were on was exhausted, and then they had to pick up and move westward. There was also the belief that slavery had to expand or die, but also obviously Eli Whitney's cotton gin permitted greater expansion of the cultivation of cotton as well, as most slaves lived on plantations and many of them worked in picking cotton. And as you can see here, cotton really does become king as it becomes a bigger and bigger portion of all U.S. exports. However, not everybody believed that slavery was good and profitable for the South, and that they should try to diversify their economy a little bit. One of those prominent members would be Hinton Rowan Helper. In his book, The Impending Crisis, said that slavery kind of reduced the standard of living, and the fact that slavery and cotton kind of hindered industrialization of the South. So you see, there were some people that believed that the South should diversify their economy a little bit, but albeit this was probably a minority's view and not a very widely popular view at all. But with that said, some slaves, even though the majority of them are used on plantations, some are used in factories and sugarcane mills and other places like that. But we'll take a look at slavery in a little bit more in depth in our next episode.